Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is the 19th day of April, 2023. It's about 12:37, and this is the meeting of the Transportation Advisory Board of the Metropolitan Council. And I'll call the meeting to order. And is there a motion to approve the agenda?
Move approval. Second.
The motion and second to approve the agenda is published. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, opposed? Carried. And now we are on to public guests that we might have that want to address the Transportation Advisory Board on a matter of concern to them that's not on the agenda or scheduled for a future public hearing of any type? Okay. On the reports, so we just had a exec meeting, and there's a couple of things coming up I think it was June is the timing of all of this. So it's something for you to think about. The unique projects category, you had a discussion about that. We had a discussion about that last month. We're going to take a look at some of the criteria and scoring, and Member Martinson has offered to take a look at that and then work with staff and come up with some ideas there. I think we'll also be talking a little bit about safety and how we allocate these unique projects funds, or whether we should think about a different category for use of those funds. Safety was bandied about in the exec committee meeting, and I know that safety was something that you all talked about this last month as well. And then we also got into a brief discussion about project year. And you know, our policy has been that if you want an extension on a project year, the general rule is you get 1 year extension. It's 1 year for 1 year. With respect to a couple of big, I'll call them mega projects in the region, one involving Highway 252, that's had 2 extensions, 2 years each, and then another in Brooklyn Center, Brooklyn Park, Blue Line extensions had 1 extension, as I understand it, already. Both these projects are delayed by circumstances beyond their control. On 252, an EAW has been ordered, and so we're going to hear in May the notion that they need to extend the project year to 2029, or the program year, excuse me. And the reason is because this environmental assessment is going to take several years to complete, and so there's circumstances beyond their control that cause them to be in this position of having to come back yet again and ask for an extension. There's 4 different tranches of money involved in that project. The total is about $26 million. Now those projects are all viewed by FHWA as a single project. So if we said, no, come back next solicitation period, there'd be some difficulties there and some complications, both with respect to the amount of money and then some other issues as well. So you're going to hear more about that in May. And on the Blue Line too, there's some circumstances beyond the control of that project that we need to visit about. So we're going to look at both an exception to the general rule at our next meeting around those 2 projects, but we're also going to look at, with respect to some of these more significant projects, and I think funding and programming, and maybe the TAC will take this up before the next meeting, and that is on some of these mega projects where we do have a history of seeing things beyond their control delay the beginning of the project. Might we change our rules regarding when you have to have your project started in the future on some of these major projects? And so some of these supportive organizations or structures for the TAB will take a look at that, funding and programming and the TAC, I think, between now and the next meeting. So those are kind of the main things I wanted to report out. And then on a more permanent basis amongst our membership, Glenn Johnson is going to be here, not just as an alternate, but he's going to be here full-time, replacing Ash Narayanan, who's gone on to a different employment, and I think has some other things he needs to contend with. So Glenn, welcome on a full-time basis.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Let me switch now to agency reports, and Mike Barnes, MnDOT.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple items here. One is I updated from last month. We've had quite the winter. Everybody here knows that. So we kind of went from our snow and ice to instant spring potholes, which was still last month, summer, there for a few days, thinking we might get some actual road blow-ups the way it was going, into some flooding, and now we're gonna be back to some more winter, but we're had those challenges, but now we'll be moving into construction, and we've done the listing of projects, so for those that are interested, you just go to the MnDOT website, you'll see the projects across the state, and especially here in the metro, you'll be able to look at those. If you have questions, there's contacts on there. If you have any thoughts or input on it, again, we have contacts there if there's gonna be any issues. The item I've been updating to each time is from a fatality standpoint. As of April 9th, we've had 57 fatalities here in the state, compared to last year where it was 79. So you can see we're down over 26%, which is a good thing. Still far from where we need to be, but this year is still about over 20% less than what we've been even over the last 5 years. So this is a good trend, and we need to continue. For those interested, there is a May 9th regional TZD workshop for those that are interested. There's staff that it's there, but also it's open to those that are interested. This is where beyond just what is the engineering, you get all the E's involved for the TZD efforts. So if you're interested, please let me know. I'll also send the information to Elaine so she can send it out for those that are interested. So with that, Mr. Chair, that's all I have, unless there's some questions.
Okay, let's see if anybody, any of our membership have any questions for you. Any questions for Member Barnes? Yes.
Of course, she has a question.
Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's great to be back. For those of you that are new, I used to be on tab, and I loved every minute of it for about 8 years, but we had to transition out. You now have Trista Metis Castillo for the Ramsey County Board, so I'm Mary Jo McGuire from the Ramsey County Board, and but love the work that you do, and I'm the alternate, so I get to be here today. So it's great to be here, and I love asking questions of MnDOT, because I don't always get MnDOT in front of me. And I'm asking my own Public Works the same question. Do you think that this is a year that there's way more potholes than there used to be, or are we just not remembering how many potholes there were last year? I feel like it's way worse this year. Is it because of the weather?
Yes.
Okay,
I mean,
thanks.
it goes in cycles. A lot of it has to do with the cycling of the weather. If you get where there's the melting and refreezing, that definitely does not help. So it's so much dependent on, sometimes we can have a real cold where we get a depth, a lot of frost, and that's where you get heaving, but the potholes typically is around kind of that thaw freeze cycle, and we'll get more. And then again, with conditions of certain roads that are getting close to needing to have some repairs, then it can kind of just enhance the fact that you just need to be doing those. So certain roadways will pop their true colors when it comes to this weather. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Anybody else have questions for Member Barnes? All right, let's move on. Then Member Bewan, nice to have you back with us.
Thank you. Good to be here. A couple of things today I think that could be of interest to the tab. Just an update on our Volkswagen program. You remember the state of Minnesota was given $47 million to respond to the Volkswagen vehicle sort of cheating scandal that was several years ago, and every state received some money. We received about $50 million. And that was really to offset the emissions that were generated from those vehicles. So I just wanted to report that we're through 2 phases of a 3-phase program over about a 7-year period, and we're entering phase 3. And the good news is that we're well on track to achieve emissions reductions well beyond what was calculated to have been emitted from those vehicles. For particulate matter, greenhouse gases, and NOx, we're on good pace. The remaining phase will again continue to focus on replacing older diesel vehicles that we want to change out with cleaner vehicles, and also to continue to install electric vehicle charging stations. Phase 3 will run through 2027, so we've got a few years yet at this. The second issue is just, it's related to the climate pollution reduction grants provided by the Inflation Reduction Act federally. U.S. EPA has begun the first phase of this, and it's really to fund greenhouse gas emission reductions for states, larger metropolitan statistical areas, and tribes. And developing and getting involved now, developing a plan now unlocks access to $4.6 billion nationally as we go forward. So we are working on a planning grant. It'll be non-competitive. And Met Council is also leading this collaborative work for the statistical area, the Metropolitan St. Paul statistical area. And their grant will be for $1 million, and the state of Minnesota's will be for $3 million. And we're in close collaboration with Met Council on this work. Finally, on this item, probably the most important point is that all municipalities in Minnesota will be covered by the state's plan and or the plan by the Met Council. We don't know a lot yet about the implementation funds. Again, the big pot of money that will be available for actually actions on the ground. This is more about the planning phase. But we are going to be setting up opportunities to communicate to municipalities, to answer questions, and that there's a way for anyone to sign up for information on what's happening and how they can hear about this and get involved. So we can provide that information to Elaine for how people can access that information.
Yeah, I think it would be an excellent idea.
Any questions?
Yeah, I was just thinking about local units of government, whether they be cities or counties or local, and the interface with MPCA. Are there staff people that are very familiar now with all the grant opportunities through the Inflation Reduction Act, where they could be a resource for either county or local governments?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, the $3 million grant that we're applying for will support some staffing to implement the program.
Okay. And if you could give Elaine that contact information, I think a lot of the cities and counties here would appreciate that sort of interface and ability to find out what those opportunities are. Thanks. Other questions for Member Bwin, MPCA related? Okay. All right. Let's move on then to the MAC and Member Crimmins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple things. Spring break's over. Oh, thankfully, I should say. But on March 30th, we had 44,000 passengers go through the air security. And just T2, in the month of March, there was 567,000 passengers went through T2, mostly due to Sun Country. And we've seen, over last year, we've seen an increase, a 10% increase in seats being used at the airport. The airlines seem to be going with bigger planes now. They're not going with the small 50-seaters anymore. And this summer, we're gonna have 224 routes. Last summer, we had 177 routes. So there's been more destinations picked up by the airlines. If you haven't seen the news, Delta Sky Club opened today on Terminal 1 on the G concourse. It's gonna hold 400 people at one time, because the other Sky Club was always backed out into the concourse. But it's got 2 levels, like 6 bars, 3 buffets, and I don't know why they complain about people being inebriated when they get on an airplane. They got all these bars in the Sky Club, but it seems like it's counterproductive. But it's open today officially. So
And that was on the C concourse?
G concourse, Delta's concourse. And then you got an important thing, not important, but something that I'm trying to get out here. I can't even find the right words. We have staff at the MAC that have received a patent from the federal government for measuring airplane noise, a procedure to measure airplane noise. It's the first patent ever awarded for that function. And now these staff members are going to try to market this program to other airlines around the world. And I don't know if they benefit personally from this, but since they work for MAC, I guess the MAC's going to maybe benefit financially from something from this. But it's the first time it's ever happened. So they were pretty proud of it. They're going to put a plaque up with their names on it and everything. I guess it's a big thing, you know. And then the last thing, we have a job fair. Again, we're short employees for the concessions, for all kinds of jobs at the airport. So May 10th, there's a job fair at the airport. They seem to be having a job fair almost every 2 months to try to get added people back to the airlines. And we had a briefing from the chief of police from Met Council. Is it Lopez? Chief Lopez? Morales, I'm sorry, the third. Yeah, he came with our police chief from the airport, and they gave a briefing on how they're gonna work together, and they're gonna monitor the light rail and make it a focus. And Chief Morales even mentioned that he took it a little farther than we thought, that terrorists like to mingle with homeless people and to interact and get into the trains and the areas. And so he's from New Jersey, I believe? New York. And so he took it a step further. I never put the two together, that a terrorist would actually mingle in with homeless people to gain access to the airport and things like that, and to other light rail places. So he's very focused on it, which we appreciate, and they're gonna make monthly reports to the commission so we can see what kind of action's going on and what they're experiencing on the light rail. So that's all I have, unless somebody has questions.
It's a lot of information. Thank you. Thank you, Member Crimmins. Any follow-on questions for Member Crimmins? All right, let's switch then over to Member Barber and get her Metropolitan Council report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of things today, because we have a long agenda. First, really good news. Several of us were there last week, but we had a lovely visit from the FTA last week to announce that we were receiving the full funding grant agreement, a total of $240 million from FTA. We were really fortunate to have the governor, both of our senators, Congressman McCollum, but also the FTA Administrator Fernandez came out and spent the day here as well as some of our representation from the District 5 office. So it was very good not only to partake in that celebration, but we had a great opportunity for several discussions and conversations throughout the day with representatives from FTA. So we're very appreciative, obviously, of the award, but also for them taking the time to come visit us and to celebrate with us. The other thing I wanted to mention was we just the other day awarded the East Side construction contract for the B line. We talk a lot about our ABRT lines. This is the line that connects between Minneapolis and St. Paul, substantially replaces Route 21, which is our second highest ridership route. At this point, we are looking at construction starting late spring with an opening in 2024. Last thing I'll mention is the thing on our agenda for the TPP, for some of the engagement we've been doing. We had several listening sessions. I just want to thank the members of TAB and even of the different counties, of the people who participated in those sessions, because we've gotten some really good feedback. We're going to hear about it tonight, but very appreciative of everyone who took some time.
Good, thank you. Questions for Member Barber? All right, let's move on to Suburban Transit Authority, Gary Hansen, or Member Gary Hansen. Member Hansen.
Mr. Chair. Well, unfortunately, motor vehicle sales tax receipts are underperforming, and but that's caused the suburban providers to have to account for this in their budgetary planning. So adjustments are being made. MVTA's eJust electric minibus demonstration wrapped up a couple of weeks ago, and initial data on that demo is promising, including low per mile maintenance cost and other advantages. Ridership continues to grow and is on pace for nearly 60% of pre-pandemic ridership for the year. Maple Grove's express ridership continues to slowly grow, and they are currently exploring microtransit service area expansion. And Southwest Transit is preparing for summer service and younger riders. They kicked off their summer concert series special service, so hopefully the weather will cooperate and we will have a summer this year. So that's my report. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Member Hansen? All right. Let's move on to our TAC Chair report. Jeni Hager, our relatively new TAC Chair. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, committee members. TAC did meet last month, and aside from the 2 action items we'll hear about shortly on the agenda, just a very robust conversation about the possible changes to the 2024 regional solicitation. So I'll share the TAC's thoughts on those when that's presented to the group later this afternoon.
All right, thanks, Madam Chair. All right, then let's move on to the minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of March 15?
Second.
A motion
Mr.
by
Chair?
Member Anderson.
I have a correction to the minutes.
All right,
The attendees, I was present at the 3:15 meeting.
okay, we'll
So
make
if the
that.
minutes could be approved as amended, I'd appreciate that.
All right. Thank you for that, Mayor. All right. So you want to make a motion on the amended minutes?
So moved.
All right, and
Second.
Commissioner? All right, any further discussion? All those in favor of approving the amended minutes of March 15, 2023, say aye. Aye. Aye, opposed, carried. And then let's move on to that consent portion of the agenda and bring Chair Hager back up, and she's going to walk us through these 6 items that they've bundled, 3 by project change and 3 by new projects, and get a good explanation of everything, and then we can vote on them as a single motion. Chair Hager.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we have 2 consent agenda items today. They're both streamlined tip amendments, and both of them are packaged amendments of 3 projects each. So 2023-18 is for 3 existing projects. The first one is a cost increase for MnDOT's Enhanced Mobility for Seniors and Persons with Disabilities program. The cost increase is related to the purchase of vehicles and overall industry-wide cost increases. The second is a change in scope and a cost increase for MnDOT's Highway 62 noise wall project. The scope change involves removing drainage elements and adding transportation management systems. These are all state funds. And the third is a cost increase and a scope change for Southwest Transit's electric bus charging station project. The scope change involves removing the purchase of some buses and instead doing more electric charging stations. And these are all federal STP District C set-aside funds. So those are all changes to existing projects in the TIP. TAC approved this unanimously. If there's any questions, do you want me to go to the next one right away, or do you want to?
Any questions regarding that matter? Okay.
Just
Yes.
one correction,
Brandon.
the action transmittal say 2022, 18, and 19 in the blue on the document, so somebody needs to just change their formatting next time. Page 1 of the, right in the blue there.
Oh, yeah, thank you for that, Member Anderson. 2023-18, okay. Chair Hager, go ahead and go on to the next portion of the consent agenda, the 3 new projects.
Okay, so 2023-19 is for 3 new projects. The first is adding preliminary engineering for Dakota County's I-35 and CASA 50 interchange project. The project was awarded congressionally directed spending in 2023. The second is a lot of line items, and it looks very complicated, but it's really not. It's Hennepin County's CASA 3 Lake Street project associated with the B-Line arterial bus rapid transit project. There are 4 funding sources and 7 lines, which brings the new money into the TIP for various components of this project, and then move some money from 2025 to 2024 because some of the project will be advanced. The whole project is in 2024. They're advancing some of the funding. And then the last one is adding Metro Transit's Blue Line Extension project. It's essentially moving from 2026 to 2023.
Right, good. Thanks for all that. Does that prompt any questions from any members? Is there a motion to adopt 2023-18 and 2023-19 in a single motion?
Second.
All right, motion by Mayor Winchell, second by Commissioner Gattel. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adoption of the items on the consent agenda in a single motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Thank you, folks. And now, no other action items for us to deal with here. We're going to move right into the information portion of the agenda, and that is, got some very interesting information in it. And the first thing we're going to do is talk about the IIJA, and we've got Todd Clarkowski and of MnDOT and Jody Martinson with us from SRF. If any of you have not yet been in the new SRF, I call it new SRF headquarters out on 394, the old Prudential building, it is just gorgeous.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. All right. So you're going to lead us through this Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the discretionary grants, and I think it's going to be a real interesting presentation. Welcome, both of you.
Well, thank you very much, Chair and Board. Good afternoon. My
I'm
name's
going to tip those microphones up just a touch. I think it'd be helpful. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair and Board. My name's Todd Clarkowski. I'm with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. I'm here today with Jody Martinson from SRF Consulting to talk a little bit and share a little bit of information on the discretionary grant program that MnDOT is pursuing right now. So, let's see, do I have control of the buttons here? There we go. This presentation has been provided to you also. Just a little background, you know, on about a year and a half ago, and back in November of 2021, there was this new federal law that was President Biden signed, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also called the IIJA Act. And it set up not only additional funding coming to all the states around the country, but it also set up this discretionary grant program, these opportunities that are available to not only the state, but also to MPOs, to cities and counties and tribes. So it provided this discretionary grant program, and much more extensive than it had been in the past. So one of the items that we first looked at when that federal law came out was this guidebook, and that detailed out all these discretionary grants, kind of provided a roadmap of each of these discretionary grants. What are some of the background, some of the criteria, some of the eligibility, some of the timing, some of the funding constraints. That guidebook provided that. So MnDOT, we took a look at that. And we also looked at that as a lot of opportunities. There were some familiarity with some of the discretionary grants, like raises and infras that we had done in the past, but the vast majority of those discretionary grants were brand new competitive programs. So back in February 22, we got together internally at MnDOT with our different offices, our bridge office, our modal offices, and we started to consider which projects we might consider eligible for all this laundry list of discretionary grants. We looked at what the timing might be also of the projects, how they were, what status and development stage they were with where they might fit into the discretionary grant program. We assembled a core team of individuals made up of different division reps, reps from different divisions around MnDOT, both internally, and we started to work with that core team on planning ahead for these discretionary grants. We also established the different leadership approval process for these discretionary grants. So as the core team works with the different offices and division, we work also with our leadership groups at MnDOT, including TP and IC, our senior leadership group, our executive leadership group, and our commissioner. So out of that process, we identified this MnDOT's list of discretionary grants that MnDOT would apply. There's hundreds of discretionary grants, but we shortlisted those down to the ones that we felt we would be the most competitive. But then at that point in time, we identified, well, what's going to be next? Then what? What should we be doing next as next steps? And that's when we identified the need to hire a consultant firm to help us plan ahead for all these discretionary grants that we were going to focus on. So we went through a process, and we were looking at a consultant firm that could help us plan ahead for this 5-year life of IIJA. We'll come up with a projects database, not only look at which projects we might apply for, but then keep those in a database. Develop a GIS mapping system. The consultant team is doing that also. And then developing important tools that we can use to communicate these discretionary grants. There's a tool that we developed called At a Glance that compares side by side these discretionary grants, because each of these discretionary grants are very unique and very different in how the eligibility and who's eligible, if it is an MPO or a city or county or MnDOT or a tribe. We have these helpful tools, these called At a Glance. Fact sheets are another important thing that we've been using to communicate these differences in the discretionary grants. We recognize also the need to prioritize our projects. We have a large number of projects that we're looking at with competitively, going after some of these competitive grants, but to help us prioritize those, the consultant team will be doing that. And then there'd be a component of grant writing. So that's the process that MnDOT's hired SRF Consulting to do to help us with over the remainder of the life of IIJA. In general, we use this idea of this funnel process. As for each discretionary grant, we look at the top of the funnel, and it provides the projects that have been identified from our districts and our specialty offices, some of our other projects, and then it starts at that point, but then we start to narrow down our projects. We start to funnel them down. We start to consider, are they even eligible for these discretionary grants? There's some funding constraints some of these discretionary grants have that might allow us in or might not allow us in. So we start to funnel our projects down through. When we get to that preliminary screening stage, we're looking at our criteria that makes up what makes each discretionary grant so unique and so special, and what's required within each of these discretionary grants. We look at also balancing some of the around the state issues, some of the geographic equity. We look at past awards of these discretionary grants, if there is a history. Like infra and RAISE, there's definitely a history of discretionary grants. But the vast majority of these discretionary grants do not have any history just yet. Each year that we move forward, there will be, but when we first started this, there wasn't. And then as we narrow that and funnel those projects down to we start considering project readiness, at what stage in the project development phase is that project really at? What are some of the levels of risks? MnDOT's from a programming perspective, we start to gather that input on just what impacts that project, if it is successful, might have on MnDOT's program. Economic competitiveness, that's when we start to look at the benefit and costs of each of these projects. Some of these discretionary grants are very, very critical on whether or not the BC should be over 1 or over 1.5. They have certain economic constraints on each of these discretionary grants. So as we narrow down through this funnel, we finally get to a point where our core team then recommends which project should we be moving forward with each of these discretionary grants. We also end up with like a tier 2 and tier 3 on the graphic, and that's like planning ahead for next year's discretionary grant. Maybe our project isn't quite at the readiness stage and doesn't meet the eligibility criteria of these grants just this year, but maybe it'd be a better candidate for next year. And so that's where it falls onto the next tier 2 and tier 3 lists for us. So we're planning not only for this year's discretionary grant, but we're looking out into the future and trying to plan for those also. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Jody here for a little bit of a description on our grants database and some of the criteria that's in that grants database, and just describe it a little bit.
Sure.
Jody?
Thank you, Todd. Again, with these grants, they're super competitive, right? There's a lot of different states that are going after this, and including a lot of different counties and cities. And a lot of times when these notice of funding opportunities come out, you really have a limited time to react to it, right? And so what we're doing with MnDOT is helping them get out of that reactionary mode and into a proactive mode, and being prepared for them when they come out, and having the most competitive projects that they can put forward in front of them, and start taking a look at it and doing the homework up front. And so they're prepared, because a lot of times you get about 8, sometimes maybe 12 weeks to write these grant applications, and they go through a lot of work. And so what we did is, if you think back to that funnel, we had a lot of different projects coming in from the districts and from local agencies, and we want to be able to take a look at a lot of projects very quickly. And so we do a lot of research into what the grants are looking at, and some of that is what's listed here. They look at your route characteristics. They look at, and those are things like, the type of roadway and the ADT. Some things you don't have control over, right? But there are certain things that you do have control over, and the sheet that you have in front of her, it's a mixture of those types of items. They look at safety, they look at the impacts to environment and climate, the quality of life and equity, human mobility, state of good repair, your partnership and your engagement, freight movement, and your project readiness. And although these look like just like a few different categories here, there's a lot of data that goes in behind the scenes here, and so you can look at a number of projects very quickly. And so what we did is come up with a low, medium, high, and very high as when we score these. And we actually are able to rank them then to get through that preliminary screening. We then look at those very high and some of the high projects, and we look at them to see which ones are going to make the most sense to bring forward. There's a lot of coordination with different agencies. There is also, what this does here is it provides an opportunity. Maybe it's not ready this year, but what can we do to make it ready next year? Or what can we do to make sure it's more competitive in the upcoming years?
Thank you, Jody. This is a graphic that shows MnDOT's discretionary grants. So I mentioned that the IIJA has a laundry list of discretionary grants. This is looking through the lens of just MnDOT's discretionary grants. So it starts out with the RAISE grant is one of our grants that we're pursuing, and low and no emissions is another one. Bus facility protect discretionary grant is another discretionary grant that we are interested in pursuing. And then our MPDGs made up of infra, megas, and rurals, you can see. And we got a number of reconnecting communities. We're issuing letters of support underneath that program. Railroad crossing elimination, Chrissy Smart Attain, Fed State Partnership Corridor, Corridor ID program. And then we have a number of discretionary grants that they haven't even issued their first notice of funding opportunities. So that's that list down below that you see on the chart. So we haven't even seen that NOFO just yet, but we are trying to plan ahead for those and looking for that opportunity also. The time frame on the top is by federal fiscal year, so you can see kind of that first wave of discretionary grants have gone through. Then this again is MnDOT's list of discretionary grants. There are many other discretionary grant programs out there, but this is the first wave for MnDOT's, looking through MnDOT's lens. And then the second wave, the second federal fiscal year, fiscal 23, has started up. So we recently, over the past couple months, we've sent in 3 projects for our RAISE, for the federal fiscal 23 RAISE program. We're looking forward to awards on June 28th for that program. The next one is low and no emissions. We'll be submitting an application for that shortly in the month of April here. And then the next series of discretionary grants we're planning for include the Protect and the MPDGs, the infra, megas, and rurals. This is a graphic that shows the overall state. When we're considering our discretionary grants, we're trying to look at the statewide perspective, and this graphic kind of shares that information. So it looks at what applications we've sent in underneath IIJA for these discretionary grants. So you can see the circles are the applications that we sent in, and the green stars are the awards that we've already received under IIJA. So you can see that there has been some success with our efforts underneath this IIJA discretionary grant program. As far as ongoing efforts that we're continuing to work on, we continue to communicate where we are with our discretionary grant program through our different offices. We've been working on debrief sessions too. So as we send applications in and we may be non-successful for that application, we meet with that federal agency and try to learn lessons from approaches on how we could do better the next round of discretionary grants. So we've been going through debriefs on each of these discretionary grants. And then for our successes, we've been writing agreements and negotiating agreements with each of the federal agencies. You can see that we've had a successful RAISE, successful infra in 22, and in 22 also a low and no grant awards were issued. Like I said, we're continuing to work on our communication efforts, pushing out information as we can through our different websites. We have a government affairs website that has information on these discretionary grants, along with our tribal website, and our state aid office has a website that talks about these discretionary grants and provides some helpful processes and supportive links. We are looking forward to the next NOFOs, so the notice of funding opportunities for the next set of discretionary grants, which include the MPDG, the mega infra and rural. We're doing a lot of work right now to try to identify which projects we should be considering for those discretionary grants, and Protect too. And we continue to work with our core team to move these issues forward. So I also want to share some information quickly with you on the tribal discretionary grant support effort that we're doing. We've got this statewide effort, but then now recently MnDOT's Tribal Affairs Unit has gone through a consultant hiring process to do the planning phases and the grant writing for all 11 tribes in Minnesota. So our Tribal Affairs group will be hiring a consultant to basically look at what, meeting with each of the 11 tribal governments and trying to plan ahead with them for the range of discretionary grants, opportunities that the tribal governments have in front of them, but then also is there areas where we could partner with the tribal governments also. So we're going through a hiring process. We expect the consultant team to be under agreement in the next month or so, give or take. And that's kind of where we are. The agreement lifespan covers the life of IIJA for that effort too. So that'll be a separate effort than with SRF's statewide effort, but we will be coordinating those two efforts to work together to look for opportunities. So with that, I just thank you very much for the opportunity, Chair, to share some information with you.
Thank you. Yeah, real interesting presentation. So any questions for Mr. Clarkowski or Ms. Martinson? Commissioner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Todd and Jody, good presentation. In the different transportation groups, I've been asking for some time about this. When are we going to hear the details about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act? Because it's quite a large multi-billion amount of funding. So it's nice to get this, my first update on how it's being implemented. Couple questions. You showed the projects, are they, because it's a Jobs Act too, are the projects have an emphasis on either jobs within the project, or do they give a rating towards like economic growth that road would present, and with that you would get jobs, economic growth? Any fact,
Yes, maybe I can start out and then Jody.
Sure.
Each of these discretionary grants have different criteria. Some have different emphasis in certain areas, and safety may be one of them, or other areas of emphasis. But every discretionary grant is going to be different. Some of those criteria are weighed heavier than others for each discretionary grant. So for a jobs-related, maybe Jody, you could talk a little bit more about that and how we're able to identify that. So.
Sure. Like Todd mentioned, everyone has a little bit of a different feel for it. And so with that sheet in front of you with the red, yellow, and green and stuff, we tailor one of those profiles for each one of the grant programs. So with RAISE, what we learned about RAISE is they do look at that. What are the impacts? It's a little bit more community driven, and what are the impacts to the jobs right along that project? And really looking at areas of persistent poverty and different things like that. Now, as we move to the one that's coming out very soon here with the mega, the infra, and the rural, they really look at freight as a large component, and regional is a larger impact. So you can guess that the economic is going to be a different look. And so that's what we really take into account when we're looking at all these different projects is some may be very high with the RAISE, but then they may not score, may not even be eligible for mega infra and rural. So you can start getting a holistic look of the program, but each one has different factors that play heavy into it.
Thank you. My other question was, you kind of answered it in the presentation. Are these all MnDOT grant, projects for MnDOT projects? Or you mentioned the RAISE grants, and I know Washington County applied for at least one, perhaps two, but one I know of for sure. And I know your map isn't too detailed, but it showed where the applications were, and unless it's straddled into Ramsey County, I couldn't quite see that dot. And you don't have to answer about ours. I'm gonna say it's recorded and you've got record of it. But what percentage of these are MnDOT projects versus RAISE grant and other county, city projects? How?
Yeah, that is a great question. The information that we provide today, it's a snapshot looking through the lens. It's a MnDOT. These are those dots on that statewide map. Those are MnDOT applications that we've sent in, or MnDOT awards. Each of these discretionary grants have different eligibility of which groups might be eligible or not. Safe Streets for All is one good example that MnDOT is not eligible for that program. Cities and counties are. There's tribal governments that only tribes are eligible for certain discretionary grants. MnDOT's not. The list that we provided today, that's looking through the lens of the MnDOT. MnDOT's eligible for those, and then those are the ones that MnDOT has applied. So if a city might have applied for a RAISE or an infra or rural or past discretionary grants, that type of information wouldn't show up on that graphic that I provided. It's just the MnDOT lens.
Thank you.
Member Barnes.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, just to add into that, because that's why with the graphic, you'll see that there really wasn't much from the Metro. We didn't submit from last year from a MnDOT Metro putting in for any of the bigger grants. One is we're working to deliver 494, which did get a large grant. And so putting in at the time, yeah, we had to get some of those done. But with that being said, we've been working with our local partners on, you know, being parts of fitting in funding as we can on some of them. So we've always said that, you know, the metro area has submitted a number of different grants from the small ones all the way up to the larger ones. There was a number of them. So again, there's going to be that part. And we've been working with the agencies to help answer some of their questions. Though again, it's been what they both said was a subset of what we have our skills and the background in, and there's a lot more. So with this, when they came in, this was from the discussion, the request here from the group to find out kind of where we were at. And I'd asked them to, in fact, even when you've seen the list, that's District 8, we just didn't even put in the metro because we probably spend a lot of time looking at the specific projects. So they picked an outstate example, and thank you for that, because you know, because with that we do have one for the metro area that does have those rankings, but it does feel like there's a lot of opportunity, and that's where I brought up in the last couple meetings when we were talking about, you know, what are we going to do with the funding we have, and what do we do with the last solicitation, and you know, what are we doing with funding, and you know, we have an additional funds that came into you know, for TAB to use, but we're really not, as a group here, tapping into what is that potential. And so from this, the presentation, what I hope you got is a little bit of a flavor or a little thirsty of what's out there as a potential, because it could be as simple as some funding going toward one category that you want to put as a priority to have locals be able to put applications, whether it's helping pay for the application, or if TAB wants to have, you know, a database of one or two of the grant categories or more, and put resources that are there to be able to help answer questions, put together something similar on whatever, whether it's one grant category or 10 or 20, the TAB has potential with that. Because again, we could be down to the end of either helping pay for grants that are there, put points into the future solicitations of those that are high, that ranked very high. Do they get more points for being able to go for other grants? There's a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm just using that as an example. But the idea today for them coming in was to show a slice of what MnDOT is doing, and is there any possibilities for this group to take this and leverage, or get you where you're thinking about it and saying, hey, we want to work with MnDOT on certain grants. You know, again, it just feels like we're missing the opportunity. We got 4 years of IIJA left. We took a year to get our feet on the ground to really get an understanding, and we're getting into a cycle. But I think TAB, at least if there was some conversation and make a conscious decision of not wanting to go for grants or do that, and if so, is there anything, because even the local, do they even want any kind of this database on some of the grants or not? Because sometimes people just don't know what they don't know. And so hopefully here, what you did is got a flavor of what you might have some opportunity, and I was hoping that it would spur some thought, so.
Right, thank you, Member Barnes. So speaking to that leverage issue, how would the TAB leverage the database and information you put together?
Yeah, you know, the database is really specific to the MnDOT projects, you know, and so it could provide an example process of how we're going at this, and describing, you know, starting from a project idea, which discretionary grant, kind of the timing of the discretionary grant, how that project might fit into that, you know, our process. I mean, I think there could be benefits in talking about the process that we're using, and that's why we're sharing this information, is to provide that, so.
I think it's a way to help prioritize and see which ones are going to be most competitive too, and it also gives you a look ahead to see what you can do to make it even more competitive. When Mr. Barnes was mentioning that the Metro District didn't apply for any grants, well, the Metro area definitely applied for grants. And so when you looked at RAISE, the cities and counties and townships actually had a higher win rate percentage than the state DOTs. So it's knowing things like that, and as you have these different projects in front of you and you have different partners at the table, you can really start having that strategic discussion about who should apply for which one, what would make sense. But again, it's really being able to look at a lot of different projects and take a little bit of the emotion out of it when you have to look at so many and prioritize those. And then you can, as you start funneling it down, you can have more and more discussions about like, what is the impact of the project going to have on the area with jobs, different things like that. How much is it going to improve safety? How much is it going to improve mobility?
Ms. Martinson, this is your chance to tell cities and counties that are here how SRF can help them too.
That's right. This is very transferable to from a state DOT to a county or city. And actually, Mr. Barnes had mentioned, as some of these projects overlap with cities and counties, you have an interchange or something like that, you can certainly tailor it to cities and counties.
Right.
And the tribes, like Mr. Clarkowski mentioned.
Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I was asking these same questions. We don't want to miss any opportunities. And I know that a lot of these grants are because we work together, you know, that different entities apply, and I think they give points if you have more than one entity. So who is making sure that the right entity is applying, that we're all working together? I mean, I can sit here and say, oh, I hope Ramsey County's involved, you know, I mean, I hope we are. And I'm thinking we are, we got great people, but I'm hoping you're talking to TAC and all these other groups. Like, this is a great group of policymakers you got sitting around here, but, you know, we've all got people that are working in these areas. So I do want a little more comfort that someone's making sure we don't miss any opportunities. I love the way that Member Barnes described this, because I have these same concerns sitting here, that we do not want to miss any opportunities. So if there's some things we should be doing together, some things we should be brainstorming, I mean, I think any of us would be willing to be at that table, but I think I need a few more people there from my county there too. Anyway.
I'm going to hold, Member Barnes, I'm going to go to Member Dugan.
Yes, Mr. Chair, members. To add on to that, I mean, right now, from the aspect of things that are on the trunk highway system, we have taken the lead, and we are meeting again with the locals and trying to work through as much of this and get projects that they want on the trunk highway system. I keep emphasizing on those, but if there's projects that are going to go in for grants that are not, they're not in the database now. There's a potential for, you know, again, those that feel more like the traditional road projects. We've got more, you know, kind of the support and that around that. That's why what the concern you had is what is the entity that could help with a lot of the other opportunities that are there. And it could be TAB, it could be where it's a few of the larger either counties or cities that want to see they just want to tap into some resource that knows more about specific grants, and they plan to do it kind of themselves. But that has been my worry. It feels like we've got a pretty good structure when it goes towards transit grants, the typical road projects that we've been doing. That feels like it's pretty solid. But all the other ones, there really isn't an entity yet. And I wasn't even trying to propose that TAB has to be that entity. What I was going towards is if there's areas that you want as a priority. I just remember it wasn't too many months ago, we were talking about certain areas that we wish we could invest more. Could we pick this project? And now I just mentioned briefly is to say, we're just not leveraging the ability to get funding besides what we have allocated, and what could that look like? And it's a wide spread. And so it does feel like TAB could have a role in helping to leverage some things, and what that means during a time where we're going to reevaluate the way the system is going to be for the next few solicitations. The early one now, maybe it's too late to do stuff with IIJA, but there probably are things we can do, and having it where we are at least identifying who is that area that can help. And it could be where it is a consultant that does go around to different places to be able to educate people, help them do that. It just feels like there's an awful lot of potential funding out there. For a small amount of investment, we could gain a lot of at least potential, you know, and that's where I'm hoping that there can be, not just here today, but in the upcoming days, weeks, we come up with something to basically get more of our money back. We all pay and it goes. How can we get more dollars here?
Yeah, thank you, Member Barnes. Member Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, folks. Great presentation. And
Could
thank
you
you
pull
for
your
saying-
speaker over, please?
Oh,
Member,
thank you.
again?
Great presentation, and thank you for explaining what NOFO is. That was one less question I had to ask. I must give you credit, there's more acronyms than I think we have at TAB. But in any event, I just want to make sure that I'm certain, I understand, the FHWA decides on what the grant may be, what the focus of the grant. And then, is it nationally competitive, or does, each state get a little bit?
It's nationally
Okay.
competitive, so.
Then, when MnDOT lists its discretionary grants, that money isn't to MnDOT yet. So they're just, so it's submitted and awarded, so there's no money to MnDOT yet, except of where it's awarded,
Right, just on the stars on there.
just on the stars. Okay. So when we're competing against, Los Angeles,
Yes.
Houston, wherever, okay. All right.
The other comment, just to add on that, the FHWA is just one of the federal agencies that are issuing discretionary grants. There's FTAs, Federal Rail Association, or Federal Rail Administration. There's other federal agencies that are issuing discretionary grants, and not just the FHWA. We've applied to a number of those other federal agencies too, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just one.
Thank you. I can, if I may, see your point, Mr. Chair, that how can anyone comprehend all this and figure out, who's on first? What's on second?
Fair point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, folks.
Yes, Member Martinson.
Thank you much for the presentation. This is very helpful. So I have a clarifying question, I guess, or a couple of clarifying questions about this. So this is like a marriage market, right? We have notice of funding opportunities that come out. Those are opportunities. We want to find those opportunities to make partnerships. The grants that we're submitting are the other side of that wedding, right? So we have ideas for grants that we want to get funded. MnDOT has ideas, counties have ideas, cities have ideas. You need to find your potential partners as quickly as you can, because in the square dance that is this thing, it happens real fast, right? So question is the process that you use for, and grants.gov is an ongoing flow of these opportunities as well as these other mechanisms. So is that process of monitoring that, is that something that you do manually? Or do you have something like APIs that run in the background that are just constantly pulling in these things into databases that then you scan? And so that's one question. And then the second part of that is, can we imagine a mechanism, and this is what brings it back to TAB, is can we imagine a mechanism whereby that information about where there's potential matches doesn't just stay with MnDOT, but it comes back to us and to the other potential applicants who might be able to be good partners in those funding marriages? Do those questions make sense?
Yes, maybe I can start.
Sure.
I did mention that when the federal law first came out, we realized there was just a tremendous laundry list of discretionary grant opportunities, and where do you start? And so we started looking at which ones MnDOT was just eligible for, and we shortened that list down. It was still pretty extensive. And then we just kept looking at what opportunities, how many resources we're gonna have to really work on this, what time frame we have. But we started with that big giant laundry list of discretionary grants and looked at which ones were MnDOT eligible for. Manually, yes, yeah. And it's a pretty extensive list. Like I mentioned though, there's some that just MnDOT isn't even eligible for, so those fell off the list right off the bat. But we just kept manually going through that. And then your second question was about NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunities, monitoring that. We've got a series of eyes internally at MnDOT that are doing that. We don't have an electronic system to do that. We just have groups. SRF's helping us do that also. They have some of their sub-consultants are helping us plan ahead for these. And why we're planning ahead for these is just because, as Jody mentioned previously, the timing, once the notice of funding opportunity hits, you only have about 2 or 3 months maybe to turn that whole application around. And that's an extremely tight time frame for anyone, for a tribe, for a MPO, for a city or county or MnDOT. So we're trying to plan ahead and get ahead of that. And that's why it's important to see what the cadence of these discretionary grants will be. That's why we're trying to map out last year's discretionary grants flowed that way, the ones that we were interested in. so that we can plan ahead for those next discretionary grants. The federal agencies haven't been very detailed on just when they're going to issue their NOFOs. Generally, it'll be a spring, summer type issue. They don't tell you when, but yet we have to anticipate that and plan ahead for that. And we're doing that by monitoring this past year's NOFOs to try to anticipate what this next year's set of discretionary grants will be.
Those NOFOs can be somewhere around 60 to 90 pages, and so that's where we read through that fine-tooth comb and match it with the criteria, and then we weight our criteria accordingly to each specific grant program.
Member Barber. Then we'll wrap this up and move on to the next topic.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't know necessarily how to ask the question, but when I think of our comprehensive plan, and we have our local planning hand guide, which was the online tools, maps, things like that, that counties and cities were able to use for comprehensive planning, that made it easier. It feels like this can be built into a tool that could be used something similarly because I go to several counties, you go out and talk to the county engineers, they're each trying to sort through all of these things and trying to figure out what fits. And it seems the more you can centralize it so it's a resource. So the metropolitan region counties can also have access to some sort of information. I don't know how we do that, but it seems like just the conversations we have, the complexities of the IIJA and all these different grant programs, sometimes they don't know where to go, and things do get missed, I think, because, you know, somebody's not sharing information, and I would love to figure out a way to get this information to all of our funding partners. I said specifically the counties, they have so many projects that any opportunity to access funding would be helpful. So I'd love to see how we could centralize this a little bit more and have it be an asset for the region too, I feel like. But that's more a statement than a question. I don't how to get it out there, want to process it, figure out how to do it.
Well, thanks for being here. Appreciate you coming in. Member Barnes, thanks for talking to MnDOT about it. Really appreciate you being here. I think we learned a lot, and we'll take it back to our respective jurisdictions and try to figure out how to do this. I'm still trying to figure out if, I like that analogy that Member Martinson was using, but as you kept talking, I couldn't figure out if we were talking monogamy or polygamy, so.
So I'm sorry.
We'll leave that for another day.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I know you want to move on, but I really appreciate what Member Barber said about, you know, we should have a central place for this. Like, I can go back to my county and they're like, yeah, we're doing what everybody else is doing. We have a capacity issue, you know, we're looking through all these, see what we applied for, and you did that, everybody's doing that. And then it's like, oh, sometimes we need to work with someone else. Well, we don't have time for that because we're just trying to figure out this. So I'm just sensitive to the fact that we are leaving dollars on the table. Every time I see this huge grant programs coming through, I worry about that. So I just think that this might be a place for Met Council tab, you know, to maybe be a place where we can, at least for the metro area, we could be a model for the rest of the state too. I know MnDOT, you deal obviously statewide, but I guess I want some direction on where this is going to go from here, where this conversation is going to go. I want to go back to my county and say, here's what we need to do, but I feel like we need to be working together. I do think Met Council is a place to have some of this. This is why we're here. We're a regional, you know, area for this. So
You might need to hire a good consultant.
yeah. Remember, Barbara has another comment.
Yeah, Mr.
But it is a
Chair,
good question.
I have one really quick comment. We started the discussion this morning about what to do with some of our unique projects funding, and this seems like this might be an opportunity.
Could be. All right, thanks for that.
Thanks.
All right, Commissioner, thanks for those comments as well. All right, thanks, folks, for
Thank
being
you.
here. And we'll
Thank you.
stay in touch. All right, we've got a few things to talk about relative to potential changes for the 2024 regional solicitation. Steve Peterson and our TAC chair, Jeni Hager, and Joe Barbeau are going to deal with these issues, and we'll start out with Steve. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just looking at the clock here, we want to leave at least probably 45 minutes to an hour for the last set of presentations here, so maybe 2 to 2:15, we try and wrap this up if we can.
All right.
Elaine can keep me on track here. So today, this is again an information item, so next month will be an action item as we release it for public comment and then back to you after the public comments. So We don't have to resolve every issue here today. It's more of an update on what our technical committees have been discussing. If you do want to give some direction today, our funding and programming committee is meeting tomorrow afternoon, where this starts as an action item. So if there's direction you want to provide, that will be incorporated into the action item here tomorrow. The first of 4 issues we wanted to bring to your attention today. The big one we talked about last month was adding points to safety across most, if not all, of the application categories. Our TAC funding and programming committee came up with 3 options, and we did some analysis on that. That's within the packet. No change to those application categories. Add 100 points or add 300 points. So those 3 options, we did some analysis, brought that to TAC, and maybe I'll bring up our TAC chair here and talk a little bit about the TAC feedback on those 3 options.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Steve. So TAC had a robust conversation about the safety measures and scoring. There wasn't a vote by TAC, but the group was generally leaning towards favoring adding 100 points to the safety measures. Really focusing in on recognizing that to really do a good job of this, more time and the benefit of a deeper analysis and more thoughtful approach would be very helpful. So the technical group is looking forward to that for the 2026 rewrite, knowing that we want to do something for 2024 to acknowledge the importance of safety in our work. They felt that adding 100 points would avoid any big swings that 300 points might result in without the benefit of that deeper analysis.
Yeah, I think with that, we'll see if there's any comments after each of these items, Mr. Chair. The one maybe nuance to this discussion, we did bring this to our transit technical group, which involves all of the transit providers in the region and others. They did not want to add it. Their preference was not to add it to one of the transit measures. They didn't see a close correlation between the existing measures and safety. And so we did hear a little bit of back at TAB last month about trying to add it to all the, do you want the total points to be the same across all the measures? We didn't hear that from the technical committees as an issue area, but that's maybe one little nuance that if you have direction on that, we would take as well. So thank you.
All right. So we had a good discussion about this at the exec committee as well. So the core question is, how do we elevate safety in applications? And the reason we were thinking about elevating it is because we've all expressed a concern here about deaths related to transportation systems, whether it's involving motor vehicle to motor vehicle, or it's pedestrians and bicyclists. Seems like we're killing a record number of those folks as we trend towards more ability to move around in that manner. Also, the federal government has this Vision Zero notion. And so as we talked about it in the tab, I thought Member Martinson had an interesting observation, because one of the comments was, well, the TAC didn't make a recommendation, but let's say, well, let's raise it by 100 points. I think Steve made the reference that this would be the highest scoring category. But you expressed it the way you expressed it.
Yeah, and this is, if you look in your packet, these are some of the tables that are in there for the 100 points. So safety would now become the highest scoring measure, and I guess that by default, your highest priority across all of the application categories.
Yeah. So the question was whether, though it is, if we added 100 points, it would be the highest scoring measure across all categories. What does that mean? Is it sounds, that number, how did we come to that? What, 0, 100, 300? And Member Martinson did a little some quick calculations I thought were helpful, and I thought if you could maybe share that with the group in terms of the weighting that we talked about, what 100 points translates to in terms of weighting. I thought that was real relevant information that you
Thank you for giving me credit for doing the math, but no, I didn't do the math. They did the math, staff did the math. So it's in our document elsewhere. It's just kind of buried in the middle of a paragraph. So if you look on page 1, second paragraph on page 1 of the information item. So the note is just that if we add 100 points, well, let me contextualize it a little bit. So first of all, why are we doing this? Why are we wanting to add to the weight? We're trying to signal to applicants that this should be a higher priority in their applications. How much higher of a priority is the question, I think, that's on the table. So if you increase it by 100 points, then that would add about 6 to 8% weight above what we currently weight safety as. If you add 300 points, the staff calculations are that it would add between 15 and 20% to those weights. So that was, I think, the observation.
And I think that's a nice framework for having the conversation. Member Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to add, part of the reason I think this conversation is coming up is just those TPP listening sessions that we've been out at. By above and beyond, the highest thing that's talked about as the main priority is safety. And so I think that's probably what's sort of prompted some of this discussion, because this is what we're hearing in communities. And so this was ways to build it into sort of the priorities for the next solicitation.
So back to that, yes, go ahead.
I just had a couple of questions, which you might have already answered in the comments. So you said the memo says nearly unanimous, and was it really just the transit providers that were against the increase in the safety criteria?
I would say that TAC was coalescing around the 100-point recommendation, that we didn't take a vote and it was not unanimous. I would say in the transit conversation, a little bit more hesitancy there and an acknowledgement that having the same total number of points between the modal categories across the board was less important than getting it right in terms of where we elevate safety. The transit working group talked about how safety is different in transit than it is with our roadway projects, for example. And ridership might be a more appropriate measure as it relates to just getting people off the road and into a high occupancy vehicle versus some of the other criteria where safety might show up, like in multimodal connections, where some of our suburban transit providers would be at a disadvantage from our urban providers.
And actually to follow
Member Rowe, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just following up on that point, because obviously the transit scores do change under these draft criteria weightings. But you mentioned that usage is a good proxy for safety in some of these cases. But I don't see, it looks like they're adding the weights to the multimodal facility subcategories rather than maybe usage. And I was just kind of curious how that was getting applied to the I'm looking at page 5 of the document. I'm just wondering how you're envisioning translating safety into that transit, if it's just primarily on the multimodal facilities or otherwise, and kind of the thought process behind that.
Mr. Chair, committee members, so that was one possible location where safety shows up in the transit applications. And we kind of have to look back to what's driving the conversation, which is those charts and those safety goals that TAB looked at back in January, and the fact that we're not on those trend lines, those are really about crashes, severe and fatal crashes. And so how does that show up in transit? And the transit working group felt that, potentially that could show up in ridership just because you're taking those people off of the road. It could show up in non-motorized connections as well, but it's maybe a less direct correlation.
Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm really for probably no changes in any of these, this presentation and any of these recommended changes, because in 2026, there's going to be a larger study and a more permanent study and giving a more careful time. But if there was some compelling reason that we would want to make any changes, the 100 points is a more modest step. 300, it's too drastic in my mind. And, one of the tiebreaker rules that's talked about using safety as the tiebreaker. So if you implemented that, that would be another way to apply towards safety. So I won't comment yet on the maximum awards, BRT limit, but I would favor, rather than, we usually deliberate a long time on changes, so I'd rather not make any changes and wait till the larger study, and that'll take place. I don't know when it'll start, but I think for 2026, which isn't that far away, it can be a more thoughtful So I'd rather not have us overreact or react in such short fashion here.
Yeah, we
Thanks.
did approach it the same way at the exec committee too. Looked at short-term implementation, to your point, maybe a more modest sort of implementation for 2024. And then then have a longer range study on what we really wanted to address and what could be the factors that would be involved in reducing fatalities, for example. Physical improvements, communication strategies, all those kinds of things that would weigh heavily in making some longer-term changes. But for the 2024 solicitation, would we want to enhance or elevate safety in some way? And you're suggesting, yeah, but take a modest approach to it. And then when we're using safety as a potential tiebreaker methodology, that might be enough. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, I would, and again, if there's a resounding consensus to make changes now in a modest way, I wouldn't, I could support that. I would like to see more people are thinking along the lines of even take less change. I mean, in 2026, there's going to be a more comprehensive look at this, so that's my thoughts.
Member Jepson, thank you. Nice to have you here in a different capacity, but still here.
Heck yeah.
Getting a regular paycheck now.
Isn't it nice? So maybe I'm confused here, but I feel like we're kind of speaking apples and oranges with the points versus the percentages. So I don't understand, and we don't need to spend the time explaining it to me if everybody else is understanding it. Why in the world do we have to increase the points in order to change the percentages? So why can't we just leave the points alone? Because to Member Geisler's comments last time, adding points just dilutes the points and adds, in my opinion, doesn't add much value. So why aren't we just changing the percentages versus even talking about the points? My second one is to Commissioner Clarkowski's comments. Yes, we could. I'm very much looking forward to an overhaul in 2026 to this decision process. But 2026 is a very long time from now, even though it's going to feel like a very short time as we're going through the years. Any time in waiting for me is people dying in my city and my county. And I am not willing to delay any sort of increase in safety percentages or that potential. So that's my position on either waiting. So if we do need to increase the points, 100 is fine as long as it allows us to increase the percentages on safety.
Member Johnson, and then Member Holberg.
Thank you, Chair. So back to this idea of, what impact will this actually make? And because I'm looking at on table 2, page 2, if we increase the total by 100 points, it only changed 2 projects that would get funded based upon the 2022 regional solicitation, or 2020 regional solicitation. And so I'm just curious, if we say we're increasing this by 6 to 8%, it's 100 points, but the actual effect is it only switched 2 projects in 2 categories. I'm just actually wondering, is that actually doing that much for safety? I don't know the individual projects, I don't know all the details to it, but you look at the increase for 300 points and you say there's 6 projects that now switched. So if we are trying to communicate to applicants that safety is important, are we doing that with 100 points, or is it, you look by category, or it really wouldn't make a huge impact? So I guess I'm looking to what did the analysis say when you looked at it more deeply?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and members. So there's a couple parts to this. One is the backwards look, which you're citing here. The second is maybe what Member Martinson said. It's more of the forward looking of we're going to signal to applicants to put in those project elements or projects that are more conducive to those safety outcomes that we're all looking for. So they're maybe sometimes it's tough to look backwards because you don't, if there's more points available and then people see that and maybe they apply differently or put different project elements in it. But certainly the more points you add in, the more impact it's going to have. So I think that's the 2 to 6 projects you said flipped. So there's a couple ways to look at it. Definitely. Thanks.
Commissioner Holberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so I asked for clarification in the exec committee because the report wasn't clear to me about whether or not you actually took a position on no, or you more reacted to if we were going to add points, this is what you thought. The response to that was is that you didn't really take a vote, that you were responding to Tab's requests for information about safety points. And I now look at the bullet under your TAC comments saying that you prefer the 100-point addition out of doing nothing, 100 or 300. So now I'm confused again. Did you actually take a position supporting the 100 points over doing nothing? Or was the 100 points preferred over 300 if TAB insisted on doing something?
Chair Hager.
Mr. Chair, committee members, TAC did not vote at their last meeting, but we did have a robust conversation, and if TAB wants to move forward with adding points for safety, TAC, it would appear, was coalescing around a recommendation for 100 points versus 300 points. We did not ask the question of whether their recommendation would be do nothing versus add points.
So your first bullet under TAC comments is probably a little misleading.
Mr. Chair, committee members, perhaps.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Guttel.
You know, this is a robust conversation, just like it was when we were in the executive committee. We really spent a lot of time on this. First of all, I think one of the consensuses, I think we're all for the 2026 in time when we rewrite this, but they're looking for the report that gives us a lot of detail on where we might be able to hone in on and use a scalpel to really put dollars where we would impact safety. So I think that's kind of a consensus I'm hearing around here. One of the things that as County Commissioner for Hennepin, I would support using the 100 points is also to signal, but also the idea is that any one of us sitting around this table who does transportation projects knows of an unsafe corner, right, road, highway. We don't need a study to tell us how to fix a lot of those already. We know what's wrong with them and we could fix them. This gives those priorities, even if it's two projects, 3 projects, it's gonna save a life, possibly. It's gonna save an injury. And so I'm for starting down the road and then later honing that and having a sharper scalpel in the future. So I wanna start here. This is a great starting place, and that's my philosophy on moving forward this way.
Other members, thoughts to share? Did you, if we want to not sort of, but I guess if we want to distill this down and get to a focus point, you could make a motion.
Okay, I could make that motion that we look at the 100-point addition.
Second, Mr. Chairman.
All right, we've got a motion and a second that we add 100 points to the across the scoring options except for transit? Or
I didn't say that.
I didn't say that, all right.
I did not say that.
I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah. That's what was recommended, is except transit.
Oh, whatever was recommended.
Member Martinson, were you going to?
Will you entertain an amendment? Since we've now created an action.
Well, I
item
asked,
currently?
will the 100 points to the multimodal category as stated in the recommendation from TAC.
All right, we got a motion and a second on that. Discussion. Remember,
Clarify the motion.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, Member Guttel. Commissioner, reread your motion.
Well, mine doesn't have all that stuff in it. I don't have the motion in front of me from TAC.
Well, there was no motion from TAC.
It wasn't a TAC.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, maybe just a.
It just doesn't have that either. Exclude, okay, I mean.
All right. So you see in their comments, they said it was not necessary in all categories. But your motion was to add 100 points to increase safety as a measure in each application category.
Well, to the roadway multimodal categories, the roadway multimodal categories. Deferring the technical committee on how best to assign the points. We can do that. Can we do it that way?
We could do it that way.
That would amend it that way.
Yep. Let's just make sure we understand our motion first.
Well, we don't have it the agenda as an action item and might.
Oh,
Might we provide
that's a fair point.
jurisdiction or,
General guidance?
general guidance to the TAC to put it on the next month's agenda, reflecting the 100
that's-
points, and then we can vote it up or down as the case
Sure.
may be.
That's a good
I'm guessing that there's not gonna be 100% support
Yeah.
for that, but
Okay.
likely majority report, and then we don't have to wordsmith a motion for an action item that doesn't exist on our agenda.
Thank you for that thought,
Mr. Chair, I
Commissioner.
think that was what the original plan was, I think from executive, that we, yeah, that's what we were gonna
Make a
do.
general
is
recommendation.
Talk about it and then bring it back at another meeting as an action item.
So do you want to withdraw your motion?
Yeah, I'll withdraw.
And the seconder will withdraw. So are folks on the tab comfortable with the notion of sending to funding and programming? The notion that we would increase safety within each, what is it, within the roadway,
Multimodal categories.
multimodal categories?
Roadway and multimodal.
Roadway and multimodal, I think I heard, right?
Yep, roadway and multimodal.
And multimodal.
Yeah. I have multimodal.
And
on mine.
reconstruction and modernization, the road categories, right? Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Multimodals more than roads.
Well, you want it in the multimodal because you want it, because we're killing the bike and the.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, I think so too, yeah. Everything but transit, I think is what you're saying?
Yeah, we're eliminating transit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Folks comfortable with that general sort of guidance? Member Martinson?
I would like to add to that, that for the 2026 solicitation, I do hope that we will revisit this question of, I would, and I mentioned this in the exec meeting, that for purposes of clarity of communication, it's a communications issue to the applicants. I think every category should be reverted back to 1,000 points, and then the weights changed, right? So that changes the weight of various things that add up to those thousands. But that, because we all think, it's easy to think in terms of what's 10% of 1,000. But now I'm trying to think what's 10% of 1,300 points here, but 10% of 11, I'm not good at math. So, I mean, you know, anyway, so I would like to see that as further consideration, because I think the weighting can be handled in a number of ways. Adding the points was just an expedient way to do it quickly for the 2024, so as to not overburden the staff who've got, let's face it, other stuff to do. So if we can just bring that back as with it, I'm happy.
Yeah, there's another.
Yes,
thought
understood.
as well. And you might comment on the work that's underway with regard to safety.
Sure.
For 2026, you know, who's been hired, and we don't have to worry about providing any funding for that. There's a big study underway.
Yeah, so thanks, Mr. Chair. So the MPO, one of the studies that we've just started at Heidi Schallberg and back from our staff as the project manager is called the Regional Safety Action Plan. So that is a consultant study that just started up, will involve many, if not all of the partners and people at this, on this table. But it is a US DOT compliant plan, so once it is finished, our local partners will be able to apply off of that plan for the Safe Streets and Roads for All program, the federal discretionary grant that just came out for this year's NOFO just came out. But so that's ongoing. It's going to be an in-depth safety study, and we'll learn a lot through that.
All right, and we'll have that in place so that we can use that study for 2026, for the solicitation in 2026.
That is correct.
All right, good.
Excellent.
All right, let's go on to breaking ties, and I think I know where we're heading. Thanks to Commissioner Clarkowski.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. We had a good idea last month by one tab member, I'm not sure if it was Commissioner or someone else, about using a safety measure to break the tie. And some other ideas did get floated at TAC, but heard that again here today as an option. But I think from the TAC perspective, they wanted it in the rules ahead of the time before we see the projects come before us. And I think that makes sense, that we kind of set the rules of the game ahead of time versus later. So that's where we're at with that. And
all right, so we had a conversation about this at the exec committee, and I thought Commissioner Holberg raised an interesting issue, that generally we were in agreement that safety measure could be used as a tiebreaker, except
If the tie was between two projects from the same applicant, and then it would defer to the applicant's choice.
all right, good folks hear the commissioner? Except if there was a tie and it was the same applicant. on 2 projects. They would then choose the project they wanted to advance. Commissioner?
Well, as a practical matter, the last time we had was actually between 2 trail projects. That would be fun to watch. And I don't know how you judge which trail project is
Safer
safer.
than the other.
You know.
Staff have thoughts on that? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, we do have a safety measure within trails, and so we would go to that and see which of the 2 applicants scored the highest. And it's based on barriers overcome and other things of that nature that safety is scored on trails. So that's how we would have broken the tie last November.
Well, trail that went in a circle would be safer than the one that
True.
crossed a river, but the one that crossed a river might be more valuable than the one that went in a circle. I mean, so safety in that is, I don't know.
You want to get on the technical committee?
Hmm?
I didn't think so. But it was a good question.
Good question.
All right. So that general direction, okay with folks?
Just, Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mayor.
Just, when we do projects, are they based on, is it counties or cities, or, so what if it's a city in the same county, is that the same? I'm not sure, I guess I don't know how that works, or is it county to county and city to city in a tie? I don't know.
No, it wouldn't be, that's not what Commissioner Holberg was talking about. It's
Okay.
just-
That would be 2 separate applicants. So in the last solicitation, Burnsville got 10 million for an interchange project. They were the applicant. For geographic balance, it was rung up as a Dakota County project, but we were not the applicant. So only the applicant being the same, not the county.
I just wasn't sure how that works.
Yeah. So if you had 2 projects that tied in your town for funding.
Got
it. You could pick which one you wanted to advance. Okay. All right, we got that breaking ties issue resolved. Now we're on to federal maximum. It was another issue that we discussed at the exec committee. Should we raise the maximum? And Steve, go ahead.
Yeah. This was something that was brought up at TAC, and we're gonna dive into it more at Funny and Programming tomorrow, some of the details, but many of these amounts for the maximum awards that you see in this column over here haven't been raised since 2014. Some have been raised at different times along the way. So the question is, do we want to, in light of all the inflation that's incurred since 2014, 5% per year, since 2018, we're seeing about 8% per year construction inflation on our system. So should we bump up those maximum awards to lessen the burden on our local partners delivering those projects? The counter to that would be to keep it as is, and then you get more projects funded throughout the region, but then the local partners are gonna have a higher, perhaps local share in being able to deliver that. So that's the conversation we're gonna have tomorrow at Funding and Programming. At Tab Exec, I'm just relaying a few things there. Some said maybe look at, we have about a 40% increase of money relative to 2 cycles ago. Should that come into play, or should we look at specific categories that haven't been touched since 2014? That being roadway reconstruction, bridges, 2 transit categories. Those 4, and safe routes to school, I guess, was the 5th one that was mentioned. And maybe zero in on a few specific categories that have held tight since 2014 cycle. So, anything else? Jenny?
Chair Hager.
Mr. Chair, committee members, so TAC did have conversation about this, and again, no clear recommendation or consensus from the group, but the group was generally feeling like looking at the federal maximums does make sense. The local agencies are dealing with a lot of inflation and higher costs on our projects, and it might not be across the board where the need lies. So one analysis that could be done is which categories are applicants routinely applying for the maximum on, and in which projects are those federal funds overmatched by a large amount with local funding to show the need for additional assistance and funding on projects of that nature.
All right, Commissioner Clarkowski, then I'm going to go to Mayor Stephenson for an explanation of the Stephenson model.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Washington County and the other ring suburban counties, I don't think we generally don't get our share of the money. And I'm not complaining about that, I understand that, but it's far less than, based on population. So with that said, my preference is to not increase the maximum, because then more projects are done, and that's the way history has told me the ring counties, Washington County has got more projects by, more projects than we end up getting some of our projects to surface. But if there's a compelling majority of people that would want to change, increase the maximum, then I think it should be done the same proportion across all categories.
Okay, I'm going to go to Mayor Stephenson, then Mayor Winshittle. He had a different idea, and then I'm going to go to Commissioner Jepson. Mayor?
Thank you. I guess my thought was, I think the math was rather simple. The 2021 allocation was 180. We have $70 million more this time than we had last time, or 2 times ago. It's about 40%. We know that a number of these categories have fallen behind on inflation by 60 or 70%. It simply is, I think, rather simple math. If you do 40%, most of those $7 million categories would be simply at $10 million. I think that for a lot of our, especially our road interchanges, we need to be able to give them $10 million, not 7. 7 is what I'll call a nice start, but doesn't get a lot of those projects very far. So I think that putting a 40% across a number of those categories is a simple way without us having to sit here and do a lot of difficult math.
Thanks, Mayor. Mayor Winshittle, and then Commissioner Jepson.
Again, we had a healthy conversation going, and we had talked about some of the categories had been raised, but there's 7 of them that hadn't been raised. And I was listening to the theme in our e-board was safety, and then there was a conversation about transit ridership. Is it back up to where it's supposed to be and things like that? And so I just looked at the categories that were left. Categories that were left were safe routes, multi-use trails, bicycles, transit modernization, transit expansion, bridge and reconstruction. And, conversation come up earlier about road conditions, potholes and whatever. So I just kind of go through this and I go, safety was our number 1 thing in there, so maybe we raised the safe route to school. And then our last solicitation, we were very strong on multi-use trails and bicycles, so maybe we bypass that one. Transit, there's been a lot of conversation which way to go, but bridges and reconstruction, we maybe add to those 3. Now we've raised 3 of the 4, where we already have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them that have been increased over the last few years. That was just throwing it out there.
Okay. Commissioner Jepson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just want to echo Commissioner Kowalski's comment regarding not increasing the maximum awards, but increasing the number of projects that could be funded. Because yes, that the maximum award may more fully fund that one project, but the project that didn't get funded might need that seed money to get going, or might only be the difference in the difference between the current maximum and the future maximum. So for us as collar counties, there are a number of our projects that were right on the line, that if we would have raised the maximum amount, a number of our projects would have gotten funded, and that would have been wonderful. But unfortunately, no dollars have been raised through that, and we're basically starting from square one. But if we had those dollars to apply to those projects, whether it's fully funded or partially funded, we at least have the leverage now to say we have raised X amount of dollars for this project, which we all know if you have some amount of money raised, raising even more isn't as challenging.
Commissioner Gattel.
Thank you. This is great conversation. Again, this is following the same line that we had in the executive committee. I'm not surprised at all. I think this going back to funding and programming to tack more and to explore further, especially looking at the projected costs and the continued escalation of inflation, but also looking at those programs that are always always have plenty of extra funding, who don't need it. I mean, if we could ferret out some of those things, and I think that would be the same projects that when we were in the exec that Mary Liz also talked about, some of those already were increased. It would be good to get the analysis done and bring this back. We can't do anything today anyway. And have some of that data, supply us with that analysis. And so we can really look, I think, again, this doesn't need across the board, but again, I'd like to make sure that projects, even in the outer ring counties, get funding, but get enough funding so that the projects can actually be viable. And that's what we'll learn from that analysis. If you needed 10 million instead of the 7 million to get a project off the ground, I'd like to make sure you got that, so.
Other thoughts? Yeah, Commissioner.
Some of this seems a little premature to me. You know, if we're gonna have a 3/4% metro-wide sales tax, a transit sales tax, it seems to me that should cause a massive reshuffling of what we fund, how we fund, what are the maximum minimums here. I mean, if you're gonna introduce 577, I just said it again, but $1 million into the system, that should dramatically change a lot of things. I mean, do we have a carve-out for arterial BRT if Met Council is getting a massive influx of money over here? Should they still get it?
Well, no, sir.
You know, so a topic for future should be a legislative recap, presentation of what that means to us, a tab, what passed, and how that might affect us going forward.
Yeah, good thought. So these decisions you want to make in June?
We have it coming back at the May tab meeting, and so, I think Commissioner Holberg had pointed out whether things happen on the Capitol or not before that is still up in the air here, but it is out for public comment, so there is time for adjustment to pass that May meeting.
Okay, so we may know more in May. We would definitely know more in June, because we'd assume that the session, well, yeah, she's smiling over there because how many special sessions has she been in over there?
Right.
Well, I was in the cone of silence for 3 weeks.
But our next tab meeting is before the end of session, so
Yes.
the likelihood of really knowing, do you think we would know?
So I don't know what the date is, but is it the Wednesday before adjournment? What's the date in May that's a tab meeting?
17th, is it, Elaine? Or?
It is before adjournment.
Oh, maybe it is close.
So yeah, it's fair. If it's not 2 days after adjournment, it's 4 days or 5 days in front of, and we should have a pretty.
Good idea.
The rumble is that the conference committees have a goal of having their reconciliation done by the May 5th. Otherwise, they'll be meeting with the governor May 6th. So whatever that means.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we're all anxiously waiting to see what's happening at the legislature, even right now, as we're talking, because their House is in session with the transportation bill. I will point out that the proposals in both the House and Senate do have additional funding for transit. They also have a lot of funding for roads. So let's not forget that it's, the proposals that are out there are for actually what we talk about, multimodal transportation systems. So I wouldn't single out one particular thing. I would recommend, though, as we're looking at, if we do look at changing the limits or at least having funding and programming, look at it. I think that we limit that more to the road side of things. We have the BRT $25 million dedicated, and then the other $7 million chunks. We do anticipate there's likely to be some additional funding coming for transit. So maybe we focus the look at the maximums for some of the road categories.
Okay, thank you for that. So we're trying to give a little short-term direction here, and there's several different pathways we could take. I'd like a little clarification from you on what Commissioner Gattell said. If we use the Stephenson model and you came back in May, could we leave that question hanging of whether we still want to see more projects of a smaller nature rather than versus large projects that would be fewer in number, but at least we'd adjusted for inflation. Does that make sense? We could see what inflation-adjusted numbers look like.
Right.
And then we could still, that's another way to ask it, I guess. Then we could still make a decision, based on those inflation-adjusted numbers, do we still like the idea of more bang for the buck, or taking on some of the bigger regional projects?
And the analysis, I'd like to see this
And the
analysis they
reasons therefore.
recommended.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
It
Did
does.
we do that?
Yes, yep.
So we,
Kind of encompass everything.
to what member Martinson would say in the exec committee, yes, and. Yeah.
No, but yeah.
So how about if we do it that way, folks?
Yeah.
Get that approach. Then we can make a more well-informed
Mary Liz,
decision. Okay.
Wait,
All right, what's next?
Mr. Chair, I think the next
Oh.
is the BRT, which we had asked for a scoping on funding, and isn't your next slide like BRT?
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, I wonder, it's a complicated topic, and I wonder if we should yield some time to the last presentation or do that
Well,
today.
but I thought you were gonna bring forward kind of a scoping document, what lines, what money's already secured, what the gap is for each of the lines and when you need the money.
So we
To
could-
see whether or not the 25 million set aside and the 7
Yeah, that's a good
makes
thought.
sense on that note, and then we can move
Yeah.
right
Get it-
on past your next slide.
Get us that information too. Okay, so what was the topic you want to leave a little time for?
Well, we have one more information item where we have some guests in on the TPP. So I think we have what we need for today.
Yeah, I think
On
you
the
do.
regional solicitation, I want to make sure that we have time for the last item. too.
Okay, and I don't think we're gonna need to talk, based on my report out to the group, anymore about the Highway 52 projects or the Blue Line extension, but we want to get Cole up here to talk a little bit about TPP. He's got several handouts, so. All right, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Mr. Peterson.
It was.
Thanks, Chair Hager.
We don't have enough information.
Good afternoon, members. I'm Cole Henniker, Multimodal Planning Manager and 2050 Transportation Policy Plan Project Manager. I'm here today to introduce two presenters that helped us with a lot of engagement over the last 2 months. I'm going to let them do their presentations, and then I'll wrap up with some next steps. I was here about 2 months ago to give TAB one of their first major updates on the TPP, although I will say it was more of a minor update. And at the time, I let you all know that this is the big year of work for producing the 2050 TPP. So this is really the first presentation you're going to see about some of the big work we've been doing on the 2050 TPP, talking about how the goals and objectives are going to be crafted and the feedback we've been hearing from partners. I just wanted to remind you all that we have been doing a lot of work with some TAB members through the advisory work group, which meets every month on the third Friday. So they're actually meeting this Friday. That includes some TAB members, some Met Council members, and we also have a separate technical working group that's been talking about the TPP every month for the last close to a year now. So we do have more committees working on this. At TAB, you can expect to see TPP updates every couple of months. So this is really your first one. We're going to start with Craig Vaughn from Transportation Collaborative and Consultants. He did engagement with a lot of our government partners. He's going to talk about the themes they heard. And then we're going to kick it over to Stephanie Devitt from SDK Communications, who did engagement with community organizations and other equity-based groups. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Craig Vaughn and let him present. Then we'll go to Stephanie and then back to me.
All right, thanks, Mr. Henniker.
Sounds good.
Mr. Vaughn, welcome.
Hello, hello. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the council. Will this advance on its own? Alrighty, good afternoon. Yeah, my presentation that I'll give for you here will hopefully go about 10 minutes or so. Cole will get this going for me. If I'm going too quickly, feel free to slow me down at any moment. Good to see some of the familiar faces that we had an opportunity to engage with in some of our other listening sessions as part of phase 1 engagement up to this point. So perfect. Okay, thank you so much. So I'll go over where we've been and kind of where we are, where we're going. So from a schedule update standpoint, the first phase of engagement with respect to the 2050 TPP goals review and update process is just wrapping up right now, our first phase of engagement. We'll be moving into a second phase of engagement that'll occur in May. I'll talk about that in my next steps commentary as well. And then we'll be wrapping up the overall project itself with respect to the work we're doing and the recommendations we're making to the Met Council staff later on this summer with final recommendations on potential goal statements. So who have we heard from? As part of our process, the listening sessions did outreach with all the counties throughout the metropolitan region, that being Scott through Anoka, including Wright and Sherburne County, or 7W. We also engaged all the cities as best as possible and townships throughout the metropolitan region as well in 2 workshops that were conducted in February, providing them an opportunity to engage and participate in the process, sharing their input, in addition to the City of Minneapolis and City of St. Paul in their own defined and separate listening session as well. There were other regional transportation stakeholders that were engaged throughout this process too, including MnDOT and FHWA, TAB memberships, suburban transit providers, and MFAC, or the Metropolitan Freight Advisory Committee. So the key here, though, is what have we heard? So what we asked, we went through a series of questions through a facilitated process as part of these listening sessions, asking how important are each of the region's goals to these community partners and stakeholders that were identified in the 2040 TPP. What regional transportation-related goals and priorities are important to folks that oversee the transportation system, have purview within their communities, and how well do they feel the region's existing plan reflects the needs and goals of their agency or organization. What do they need from the region's transportation policy to do their work or bolster their work moving forward? What type of support can it best provide? And then any additional feedback on the region's 2040 TPP or recommendations for the 2050 plan update, right? So we're asking questions whereby we want input and feedback so that we can try to distill that information and turn that around into how can we make changes or updates to the 2050 TPP goals moving forward. So here's where I'm gonna probably lay on this slide for quite some time. All of the information, and it's a substantive amount of information, has been provided in your packet with additional detail beyond what I'm going to go through on the slides here for you right now in order to be respectful of everyone's time. But as you heard earlier in the robust conversation you just had regarding the regional solicitation, that the overview of themes, the first one, and it kind of is listed as first because it was our #1 priority. Deaths and serious injuries need to be reduced. That was something we heard in each and every one of our listening sessions. Quite often there's varying context to each of these, which we are going to be coming back to the stakeholders as part of the Phase 2 engagement. But a couple of key takeaways were safety on the system is a core function of transportation and should place more importance on this area. Safety and security are our biggest concerns. Oftentimes when we talked about safety, the concept of personal security or personal safety came up. And if we can't provide safety, we're not fulfilling our role as stewards of the public transportation system. So it was consistently rising to the surface for folks. The next one I'll highlight here is with respect to equity as a top priority for many, but that it needs to be more clearly defined in order to be effective for everyone across the region. Not necessarily a one-size-fits-all, or that the definition of equity means something different to some folks depending on their context. Here's a couple of highlights too. Just plain and simple, what does equity mean? What does equity mean to the council? What does equity mean to these varying stakeholders? Ensuring disparity reduction efforts are key for the counties, as well as other cities and municipalities throughout the region. And from a couple of ones, the key takeaways were healthy and equitable communities, as well as making sure that we're connecting with our communities of color and communities of regional that are receiving or going through regional disparity, and ensuring that we have equitable outcomes for folks across the region. The next one here that's on your list and shown on the screen here is maintaining our current system where it makes sense, but improve and enhance when possible. So that gets at our system stewardship, our state of good repair. Couple of key highlights here is that we need to modernize the system and define what that modernization means. System stewardship is more about how we invest in the system rather than just simply maintaining it in a state of good repair. That's actually a very key comment that was received from some of our TAB membership in order to understand how best the system can be maintained across the region. The next item that's listed here as well is with respect to expansion. And we've identified this and broken it out in two different kind of inset bullets here to underscore the fact that roadway expansion is needed to accommodate growing communities, those communities that are urbanizing maybe outside the urban core, and that roadway expansion is unnecessary quite possibly or should be limited, but other types of expansion are needed more than likely within our urban core, right? Where we don't have the opportunity to expand just the same. And a couple of key highlights from that conversation is the demand for system expansion is there, and we need to proactively address this to prevent congestion and safety concerns, or that more demand for system growth than system stewardship might very well be the point in some of our outer ring areas as well. Would like to see the TPP acknowledge growth in these rural and suburban edge regions of the metropolitan area. With respect to where roadway expansion is unnecessary, we'd like to ensure that we can support expanding transit while limiting expansion as necessary, and expansion happens differently in different contexts is a key takeaway. With respect to multimodal investments, I believe there was a significant amount of conversation in our previous presentation regarding multimodal needs as well. The comment here is that, or the key theme here is that multimodal investments are important to increase mobility, but need to be context specific and will have varying impacts depending on how implemented. A couple of key takeaways is that it's difficult to acquire funding for our multimodal projects for regional trails and non-urban areas was something we heard. There are a lot of transit opportunities across varying counties, but they don't see the funds flowing into their county spent to support that need. So just varying considerations that need to come into play. For the most part, I'll agree that transportation systems need to be resilient against climate change impacts. However, again, there's a contextual theme there just the same too, when looking at it and seeing that our roadways are impacted by the fluctuations in climate and weather and would like leadership on how to address this across the region. And looking at it also to say, well, what is the cost of weather-related disasters? And what is the cost of not doing anything about it right now? And how will that increase going forward if we do not put attention to it? The last set of key themes that I'll end on here with my comments and remark before going to next steps are relevant to opposing views on the environment and how to go about mitigating impacts or environmental impacts. Key themes or takeaways where we need to be leaders in actions and policies that mitigate climate change to meet state, regional, and local climate goals, and mitigating the transportation system's impacts on the environment is not a priority in some areas. Other goals are more important to folks. Well, what does that really mean? I think on one hand it means that transportation system is the biggest contributor to greenhouse gases and needs attention to some, whereby other priorities like safety or maintenance and preservation of the system need to come before looking at spending money on those mitigation measures, or that we should get ahead of the environmental issues rather than being reactive instead of proactive, versus there should be a shared understanding of the trade-offs that are necessary or what will happen if climate change is addressed within the TPP as a priority focus. With that being said, I'll end my comments regarding the key themes and allow you an opportunity to look through, give me a moment here, it'll take me a second. Allow you to go through the substantive information that's concluded herein, as well as all of the detail that is provided. And with respect to next steps, I had talked about the second phase of engagement. So one thing that's really key to our outreach with the stakeholders across the region is that we come back to them and have a circular feedback loop to say, this is what we asked, this is what you told us, and this is what we heard. Now, let's hear what your strength of preference or priority is regarding these key themes and what we heard across the region. How can we best set the transportation policy plan up for success moving forward? So thereby, we're looking to hold 2 workshops within the early May timeframe. We've actually chosen 2 dates. That information should be distributed shortly here in the next day or so. We're looking at May 11th and May 18th, one in an online format and one in an in-person fashion, whereby we'll go through exactly the bullets that I already stated here. With that said, that closes my portion of the presentation, and I would ask if I could stand for questions now, or if you have any questions of me now, Chair, or members of the council.
I think that's a good thing, good approach. Yeah, questions? at this point in time? All right, Commissioner?
I just have a comment. I want to say, county agrees that with some of the comments you've already made around the need for Met Council to better define equity, I think that will help guide us in a better position. The other thing is I think, when we look at the whole issue around climate mitigation, us as counties, we're doing a lot of work on this, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of this being a regional thing with the state, with MnDOT, and, to reach these VMT and greenhouse gas reduction goals. But the continued problem is the funding. Presents a lot of challenges in achieving, some of these goals and everything, and so that's a tough conversation that probably needs some further discussion.
Understood.
Other thoughts, comments from cab members? All right. I thought too interesting, just from a commentary standpoint, that the overview of themes, your slide 6, contained so many of the same issues that we've talked about here in this policymaking body. Maybe with the exception of environmental mitigation themes, but the opposing expansion themes, it's something that, we have a regular conversation about here. More to come here. I think it will be very helpful from a guidance standpoint as we get down to making some recommendations on the draft of the TPP. So, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Greg, if you want to bring up the second presentation. No.
Well, that was interesting. All right, thank you. So my name's Stephanie Devitt. I'm with SDK Communications. I'm going to share a little bit about the listening work that we had done in complement to Craig and his team. So the focus of our charge was really equity engagement, and we did this throughout March with a couple methods. We did one-on-one in-depth interviews. We talked with about 28 individuals there, asking questions about personal priorities, reactions to the 2040 goals and objectives, and then also getting some early feedback on the overall 2050 vision for the region. We did 2 listening sessions as well with a broad cross-section of individuals, and then had a survey available as supplement. And specifically the groups that we heard from about 75 individuals overall. A majority of those, we tried to focus on groups that were really mission focused on equity in some way, whether that was groups working with the urban Indian community or specific communities of color. We also spoke with those working on climate-friendly transportation. We spoke with people who really specialized in attention to age-friendly communities and serving the disability community. Also some business associations, corridor coalitions, water and land use. So I'm also going to share some key themes similar to what Craig had shared. With each one of these themes, I'm just going to talk you through a front page that has a couple bullets. After that, you're going to see a few pages of quotes in your presentation, and I'm just going to skip through those for the sake of time. But overall, number one, in the conversations that we had, equity was really the top priority for many, and people are really looking for more clarity about what the Met Council means by equity, and in particular, equity as it relates to transportation. So they're really anxious to see the Met Council develop a definition of equity. Some also talked about the scope of equity. Are we thinking about equity as our transportation policy forward and how we allocate resources, or are people also thinking about equity in a retrospective manner? For example, repairing past transportation harms, such as in the Rondo area. One other thing I would just note here in this theme and in many others, when we were speaking with these individuals who oftentimes are working in some sort of policy, but might not be working in transportation day to day, it was very interesting that many of the conversations would start talking about Met Council and transportation writ large, and would very quickly kind of jog over into conversations about Metro Transit and transit experiences specifically. And we heard that quite a bit in the equity conversation. Additionally, that came up quite a bit in safety. So one thing that stood out as a point of difference in the conversations we had from some of what we heard from cities and counties is that most of the respondents were talking about safety, in particular in terms of personal safety. When they would talk about that language, we only had 3 folks mention bicycle or pedestrian safety. Other people were talking about safety in terms of experience on transit, or maybe even diversity of experience in the enforcement of safety measures in transportation, so traffic stops, things of that nature. It's also worth calling out older adults and people with disabilities really highlighted safety as being really essential to their ability to access a number of services in the community. And then we heard quite a bit about transit specifically from our Native American leaders that we interviewed. They really highlighted that topic as well. Additionally, we heard quite a bit about system maintenance, but there was definitely a tension that existed between preserving the existing system and really thinking about how do we invest in the future of transportation for the system that we want into the future. So respondents really talked about finding that balance between caring for the roads, potholes, things like that today, and really thinking creatively about how do we invest in the future system. Additionally, people talked about climate change quite a bit. So I noted in our questions, we started first with the 2040 goals, which talked about sustainability but did not address climate change directly. And then we talked about the 2050 vision. So we heard many comments from folks, even just in responding to those 2040 objectives, where they called out the idea that climate change was not mentioned explicitly in the language of the goals, and they were very happy to see that identified in the 2050 vision. Some even hope to see Met Council go further. And then an additional theme that we heard quite consistently across many of these conversations was really this idea of thinking about a multi-node future. So some people talked about it in terms of an aging community and what might be the future transportation needs for people who live outside of a downtown area but might have great transit needs. Others talked about it in terms of, you know, if we're moving to a work from home culture, what does our downtown system look like? And do we need to think about nodes of commerce and some of those things as we plan our transportation and where people might want to go? So there's many flavors and varieties of how this idea came about in conversations, but it was a consistent point of, I would say, both commentary and questions in terms of what is that future structure of how our communities work, and then how does our transportation system support that? In addition, I just wanted to offer at a high level some points that were not explicitly asked about in any of our questions, and yet they came up with enough consistency that we thought it was worth acknowledging it and bringing it to your attention. With each one of these, there's a series of supporting quotes, but I'm just going to stay on this slide for the interest of time. So the first one is accountability and measurement. People talked a lot about the 2040 goals. They thought they sounded interesting, and their question was, what progress has been made since those goals were drafted in 2014? And how do we think the next plan will be different? Are there ways to think about measurement in this plan that can help create more incentives for the goals that the Met Council puts forward? Or how can we be more clear about Met Council's contributions to the goals that we say we espouse? Another one was don't forget the economy. So there were some economic language indicators that were in that 2040 goals. Those were not explicit, at least in the drafts of the 2050 vision. And we heard from a few people just an observation that that language of any economic connection was not part of the regional vision so far. They were asking a question of, should that be part of the language or consideration? This idea of uncertainty post-pandemic. So some people talked about it as a point of personal anxiety. It's hard for me to imagine 2050 when I don't know what next week looks like. Some people talked about it as an opportunity. We're in such a period of great change. Can we think about transportation differently because of what we're learning post-pandemic? Housing and transportation connections. So this took many forms, from people talking about just the challenges of I would say, like if you're living in your car, or the unhoused experience, like getting access to jobs and things like that, how that's impacted by the system. Others talked about it in terms of transit-oriented development and some of the growth that's happened in housing, and a variety of other contexts. But people very often would talk quickly about housing when we were having a conversation about transportation. The fact that it was so seamless across so many conversations was a point of interest. Additionally, the opportunity of federal resources, there was already a presentation to that nature earlier, so I don't need to belabor it, but it is on the community's mind. And then finally, just to what I had noted earlier about how so often conversations would start talking about the Met Council and the Transportation Policy Plan and kind of jog over into a conversation about Metro Transit. Overall, people had some questions about what is the Met Council's role in transportation and should we be paying more attention to this? So I think there's a real opportunity for just communication and education as you think about involving other audiences and communities in some of these planning processes. So that was a rather brisk overview. I know we're getting to the end of your time, but would also be happy to respond to any questions.
Your presentation that you prepared for us, yours was more of a summary, but there's a lot of content-rich material in there for us to look through and think about as we work on developing the TPP for 2050. So thanks for the good work. Questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just on page 2 about who you heard from. I mean, this is great information. I see it, is it like 30 people with 28 interviews? Is that by design that you heard from so few people? I mean, I can think of some community groups where there's 30 people at a meeting and like I co-chair active living. I get 40 people at a Zoom call. Sure. So I guess we could have brought it to them if we needed more people, but that would have been, of course, one county. Was this by design that you kept it really small, or were you? I'm just curious about your outreach and whether you think this is if this is as good a feedback as if you got it as good a sample as we could get.
Sure. So I think there's a two-part question there. So the idea and the strategy behind the approach that we took is that we had a pretty narrow window of time to work with.
Okay.
We started this process in mid-February. We wanted to get stuff done by end of March. And so we made the strategic choice to err on the side of hearing in depth from people who could really wrestle with some of these questions, because it is somewhat theoretical if you're not doing transportation day to day to imagine a transportation system and a funding system 25, 50 years into the future. We thought having the opportunity to interact with folks and really make sure we were hearing them fully was more important than volume at this juncture. I do think we did acknowledge to everyone who was in this process that they would have an opportunity to contribute to the next steps that Craig mentioned. And then we also acknowledged to them that this is the first step in what's probably going to be a longer process. So I imagine as things become more concrete, there could be added opportunity.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Anything else? Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Cole.
Member Schember.
Could you give us an assessment of how well the respondents were able to be intellectual about 10, 20, and 30 years out versus the problem of the pothole in front of my street tonight? And there are a lot of problems in transportation right now.
Right.
How well were they able to get into that visioning and planning mindset?
Yep.
Yeah.
So we were selective in who we spoke to try to speak with people who are somehow representing the voices of their community at a policy level, so at least they could think and kind of project that way. But I will say, even in that instance, like I mentioned, so often those conversations would quickly dogleg over to Metro Transit, because that's just what people knew to think about. But I was struck by also just how many questions people had about, should I be paying more attention to what Council is doing on transportation? I think there's definitely a desire to engage, but an appetite to understand the process more so they can be smart about it. So I think that is an opportunity over the process going forward.
Good. Thanks, Member Schember. Anyone else?
Anything else?
Okay. I want to make sure we leave a little time for Cole here to get the next steps.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So come on up, Cole, and let's talk about next steps.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about both next steps and why this is such important work. And, I think today's meeting really highlighted the importance of this work. We heard from MnDOT about all of these funding opportunities, sort of an ad hoc approach as a region to applying for them. One of the things Craig didn't mention, I accidentally skipped a slide, but there was one theme that was also in our thing, which was that we have way too many priorities, and that we don't have a clear set of agreed upon priorities which to me points to why we have 3-hour tab meetings sometimes talking about the regional solicitation, because we're often arguing over competing priorities. You saw in some of the themes, there are some agreed upon priorities, and there is a need to maybe highlight some of those. You know, it shouldn't take us so long to figure out how to prioritize safety as a region. Everyone agrees it's important, and we're often arguing over the details, when what we really should be doing is elevating it to an important level. Not a criticism of this board, just saying we need to be more upfront with the public and with our partners about what our priorities are. So with the 2050 TPP, we are looking to be more strategic. We want to say what our priorities are and maybe acknowledge that some of our priorities aren't top priorities. There may be priorities for some, they're not necessarily priorities for everyone. You know, safety is not a good example. Safety is a priority from everyone. We heard that clearly. So as Craig said, we're going through the process now of drafting potential goal statements to do some prioritization with those same partners we just engaged with, and then figure out what the draft goals for the 2050 TPP are going to be. And, you know, the goal concepts we're going to draft are going to give direction in a couple areas. They're going to give direction around investments. Really, our goals and objectives should be driving our investment decision making. I think we heard this at TAB last meeting. What is the regional vision that we're trying to implement with things like the regional solicitation? Not just the regional solicitation, though, it can also drive MnDOT funding. You know, MnDOT takes investment direction from the Met Council and from the TAB when investing in the metro area, and transit providers as well. You know, they're all doing planning in the metro area that takes direction from the regional plan. It also can give planning direction, so it's not always about investment. You know, the Met Council does have an authority to review comprehensive plans, major significant projects in the region, and make sure that they're consistent with what we're trying to accomplish as a region. So we tend to focus a lot on the left column here, investment direction, but there is another piece of direction the TPP can give. So I wanted to talk about how this relates to the regional solicitation as well. Obviously, we're talking about 2024. We're going to get that out the door sometime this year. Concurrently, we're drafting the 2050 TPP, and then later this year, we're going to start up the evaluation that'll prepare for the 2026 regional solicitation. We want to just acknowledge that the 2050 TPP goals and objectives should drive the 2026 regional solicitation. It's really the opportunity for you all to say, where are our priorities? You know, you can't wait until the regional solicitation to establish what the region's priorities are going to be moving forward. That comes from the TPP first. So just wanted to acknowledge that the timeline for the solicitation is actually going to carry on a year or two past the adoption of the 2050 TPP. So we recognize that we're both going to adopt the 2050 TPP with a strategic vision for transportation investment, and then probably have to come back and revisit it to align with what we ultimately decide on the 2026 regional solicitation. But that alignment should happen more at like the action level, the more specifics, you know, which categories do we want to invest in, what are our most important criteria, whereas the direction on what is most important should come from the 2050 TPP. So I wanted to give a few examples. I think this is much more tangible when you see this in real time. This is what we could say, these are just conceptual, these are not proposals. If we were to say safety is a top priority goal, let's say we have 6 goals and we want to say 3 are the top priority. If one of them is safety, and we might say eliminating serious and injury deaths is one of our most important things to do in safety, we should have a policy that says that's what we want to do. And then we should have actions that support that policy. You know, one action could be that we just create a category that's about eliminating serious and injury deaths. You know, we have modal categories today. We do not have a category that says that is one of our #1 priorities. We could give it a lot more points. And you guys were talking today about 20 to 25%. We could give 50% of the points to one of our top priority visions for the region. So that's just one example in safety. You know, another one we heard that was really important to everyone was multimodal investment is a top priority. This is a really rudimentary example here, but you know, if one of our objectives is to build a network of high-quality bike facilities, you know, we could just say, let's create a category that does that. We have a vision for the regional transportation bike network. Why not create a category that invests in it, or give a lot of points to that particular network that we have a vision for in the plan? Again, not a proposal, just a conceptual example. If we're talking about something as a secondary goal, I'm not saying climate change mitigation is a secondary goal, just using it as an example. And we have a goal that says this is a really important goal, but it's you know, maybe secondary to safety and other things that we heard were more important agreed upon. And one of our objectives there might be that we want to have 50% of the vehicles in the system be zero emission by 2050. That's a pretty aggressive goal, fairly consistent with what we're hearing at the state level. We could have a policy that says, we really need to prime the private sector. We can't buy everyone an electric vehicle, but we can do things in the public sector side to help prime that market to convert to electric vehicles. So we may set aside $50 million, not necessarily all from the solicitation, a combination of MnDOT funds, a combination of some of those competitive federal funds we were just talking about every year to start building towards that eventual goal of electrifying the fleet on the private side. Just looking at VMT as another goal, we know that we have a per capita reduction of VMT in statewide plans from MnDOT. We should be evaluating all projects based on their contribution to that goal. Even as a secondary goal, just asking every project to say, how much VMT impact is your project going to have, positive or negative? And that gives us something to evaluate against regional goals as we're moving forward. None of these policies, by the way, are in the current transportation policy plans. You can kind of see the gap between what we're saying is important and what we say is a policy. And then the last one here, infrastructure resilience, sort of the flip side to climate change mitigation is adaptation and resilience. We want to make sure that, for example, our principal arterials are uninterrupted by significant interruptions like weather or even other disruptions that maybe aren't weather related. And so we should be investing in key corridors to harden infrastructure in those particular locations to be resilient. And so, one way we could get at that is just assigning a significant amount of points to flood mitigation risk. We don't have much of that in the current regional solicitation for roadway projects. And then also, investing in green infrastructure and heat resilient infrastructure is another thing that we don't talk about today a whole lot in our investment decisions. Again, recognize that might be more of a secondary priority, but still important relative to overall how we're investing. So these were just examples, and they're meant to see how this work that we're doing right now is going to lead to direction in the next regional solicitation, and hopefully, long-term, make these discussions at TAB about how to tweak the solicitation easier, because we can point to a much clearer strategic vision that we all agree upon in the 2050 TPP. That's where we're headed. This next round of engagement that we're talking about doing is going to help us identify what those top priorities are. So if you wanted to say, what should the 2026 regional solicitation prioritize? The time to engage is now on the TPP, starting in May.
Yeah, good, great report. Thoughts, comments, questions right now? Okay. I want to thank all of you for staying here for this really important information. It's nice to have half the tab still here to hear where Cole is leading the TPP conversation. So, and thanks to our consultants too for helping us define issues through this work group. And we'll be back at it again in May as a group. Okay, thanks, Cole. Thanks, everybody. We stand adjourned.